Hello everyone, this is Jotto, and welcome to the Managrind tournament recap, talking about the top decks, talking about the top cards, and the state of the metagame, which comes out in an article on Friday on Hearthstone.com. Speaking of Hearthstone, I'm going to start putting the deck lists in the description on request of a viewer, actually, because if you do it in different languages, it's kind of difficult to actually transfer. So I'll put the deck list I actually get these from in the description from Hearthstone, and we'll see how that goes. Anyway, without further ado, let's get started, shall we? Top 4 from NA, we had in first place Go Rush. Second place, Twitch TV it's D4 Versus, I think. It's a ridiculous name. Anyway, and tied for third, we had You're Too Easy and Cazador. On to Go Rush, who was playing a Warlock Zoo deck. Now, Warlock Zoo is one of those decks that really focuses on rushing your opponent down as quickly as possible while also using card advantage engine in the terms of life tap. As for the minions, in this particular model, we have Leroy Jenkins' final finisher along with 2 Argent Commanders, which is an interesting one. This is minus the Doom Guards from what I can tell, but it actually has the Argent Commanders instead. This is very similar to the Force End Zoo deck that we actually saw from Fight Night. Rest of the stuff, we have Defender of Argus along with Young Priestess, Abusive Sergeant, and Dark Iron Dwarf, and Direwolf function as all of the buffs, along with Shattered Sun Cleric. Pretty much, there's a lot of buffs in this deck, a lot more than is normal, to be honest. It's a lot more than normal, even for Zoo, but one of the major things that defines Zoo over standard aggro is all the buff-focused play. So, what are these buffs targeting? We have Knife Juggler along with Argent Squire. Argent Squire is a very, very versatile thing to put buffs on because it just doesn't die. Knife Juggler generates a bunch of damage on its own. Then have Flame Imp, one of the best 1-drops in the game. Harvest Golem, one of the most resilient 3-drops in the game, will pretty much live through any board wipe, get enough damage in. When you kill Harvest Golem, it doesn't actually lose any attack, which is kind of crucial. Lepergnome, guaranteed damage, and Voidwalker is extremely good. Don't underestimate Voidwalker. Early Taunt, especially with the lack of shield bearers in here, early Taunt is vital. It stops your opponents from doing things like hero powering or just trading off with your more important minions like Flame Imps. As for the spells, we have 2 Soulfires, 2 Power Overwhelmings for the burst damage, the full set, and 2 Mortal Coils, also uncommon. Normally you only see 1. On to, I'm just going to call them D4 VS. Anyway, on to the Hunter Rush deck. Now, Hunter made a bit of a comeback this week. A lot more people have figured out how to play it, especially the mid-range deck. Don't underestimate how difficult that is to play. There's a lot of play in that mid-range deck. Hunter Rush has a bit of it, but most of the skill cap in Hunter Rush comes from tracking. It's similar in the mid-range deck, but then you also have to use your combo defensively as opposed to offensively, and if you mess that up, it just completely messes up your entire game. Anyway, onto the actual deck list. As for the minions, a lot of one-offs. We have Leroy Jenkins, Arcane Golem for the straight burst, along with Knife Juggler, which helps out a bit with Unleash the Hounds combo, can also just apply pressure, and Iron Beak Owl to get over taunts. Rest of the stuff is 2 offs. We have 2 Wolf Rider for burst and continuous pressure, Lepergnome, burst and continuous pressure earlier on in the game, less powerful but earlier, and then Starving Buzzer to draw off Unleash the Hounds along with Timberwolf for that massive Unleash the Hound combo. Onto the spells, playing 2 Explosives along with 2 Freezing Traps. These help power the 2 Eagle Horn Bows, which can sometimes do 9-12 damage each, which is a big deal in this deck because the aim of the game is to rush down your opponent as quickly as is humanly possible. Then we have Animal Companion, one of the single best 3-drops in the entire game. It's mostly used for applying pressure. If you get Huffer, it can be really good. Leok is the worst one, but it still works well on Unleash the Hounds. Misha is arguably still the best one. It just allows you to apply a lot of pressure, and your opponents to focus on that as opposed to things like Wolf Rider, for example. Then we have 2 Hunter's Mark, which along with things like Unleash the Hounds, can just get over taunts very, very easily. Kill Command provides reach, along with Arcane Shot, and tracking lets you get the combo pieces you need. The deck is very reliant, just like all Hunter decks, on the Unleash the Hounds combos within the actual deck. Unleash the Hounds is arguably broken. Not arguably, actually, but the entire deck is driven by it. So, in other words, if you see Unleash the Hounds on a tracking, unless the other card kills them or sets you up to kill them, you always take it. it's the best card in the deck by far, and should be treated as such. It has so many different combos. This deck isn't as combo focused as the next one we're going to talk about, but it is still fairly important. Did I just mess that up? Yep, I messed that up. Yeah, I need to remember not to do the slide thing. Anyway, moving on to You're Too Easy, who's playing Hunter Midrange. So, this deck is slower than the previous one. Now, what do I mean by that? It's still playing the Unleash the Hounds combo with Starving Buzzard and Timberwolves, but this variant also plays Scavenging Hyena because you're doing it later, so you just get a big threat out of it. Then it has things like River Croc for early damage, Stone Toss Boar to make it even more combo focused, with Stampeding Kodo, Savannah Highmane for sort of later game pressure. Rest of the text in this deck, we have Direwolf Alpha, sort of a third Timberwolf, and Houndmaster, which can be put on lots of different things to win the game against some aggro decks, or just put a lot of pressure on. If you put it on a Savannah Highmane, for example, you're hitting for 8. As for the spells, they all function pretty similarly as they do in the other deck. Only difference here is that we have the 2 flares. You really need to clear those traps in this deck. Not so much in Rush, but definitely in this deck. And also the 1-off Deadly Shot, because you're playing a little bit of a slower and you could say fairer and more standard Hearthstone game. So, on to the final deck from the NA. We have Mage Aggro from Cazador. Mage Aggro? It's been a long time since I've seen a Mage Aggro deck make it out of Limited. Even in Limited, the deck doesn't do too well. It's a force in the metagame, but it's not that successful. So I was very surprised to see this here, I must admit. And this is probably going to be the deck I do the article on this Friday. Anyway, starting with the minions, we have the later part of the deck first with Cairn, Ragnaros, Sylvanas, and Faceless. Now, Cairn and Sylvanas are very, very mid-game focused. Ragnaros in this particular deck is a finisher, not so much a board control, but an actual finisher. Same with Faceless. You want to replicate your Ragnaros, your opponent's Ragnaroses, or Ysera or something, and take card advantage away from them. Things like that. Faceless is a much more offensive tool than defensive, unlike normal. The rest of the deck, however, is just pure offense. We have Azure Drakes for cycling, along with all the spell damage you really need for some of your stuff like Fireball and Frostbolt. And we have Amani Berserker for that 5 damage swing on turn 3 if you ping it, or on turn 2 with coin. Fairy Dragon, another very aggressive 2-drop. Harvest Golem, very efficient 3-drop. Then we have Loot Hoarder. It's a 2-drop. You want an extra 2-drop on top of all of your other 2-drops. There's a lot of them. This sort of goes where the second Ooze would go. You want a lot of 2-drops to make it consistent, but Loot Hoarder cycles anyway, so it's not the worst 2-drop you can have in there. It's arguably very, very good as a filler. Onto Mana Worm, one of the single best 1-drops in the game. It will become generally a 2-3, although it can become a 3-3, although this is a little bit unlikely, but 2-3s definitely not unheard of. Sorcerer's Apprentice, Raptor, but the -1 spell cost is actually very relevant in this deck. It lets you cast Arcane Missiles for free, Frostbolt for 1 mana, Polymorph for 3 can also be relevant, Arcane Intellect for 2, which is more relevant than you think it would be, because Arcane Intellect is a bit of a tempo loss, so if you get it down for 2 mana, a lot more handy. It means on turn 4 you can ping with it. Fireball's reduction doesn't really come up, because those are generally finishers in the deck, a lot of burst, although don't be afraid to use burn to take out big taunts. As for the rest of the creatures, we have 1 Ooze, because this is very soft to Hunter and you need to kill that trap bow. Then we have Water Elemental to freeze all the weapon classes, and also it really hinders warrior control. They have to execute this thing. And lastly, 2 Sengens to help beat out the other aggro decks. The other major advantage that Mage Aggro actually has over the other ones, besides the freezes, is the Polymorph. Polymorph is essentially a hex that doesn't stop aggro. It's actually better in aggro than hexes, worse in control because it can attack, but you can always hero power to kill it anyway. Lastly, the other thing it really has going for it is reach. It has the Arcane Intellect, a straight draw from its deck, as opposed to drawing from your opponent's deck, or having to life tap 1 card at a time. You can just draw straight for 2 cards, and it has a lot of reach. Frostbolt, Arcane Missile, Fireball, all of its removal spells can essentially be targeted straight to the face. On to the top 4 from EU, we have in first place Dapper Rat Chick. Names are incredible this week. Second place, we have Semi-Jew from MYM. And tied for third, we have Thatnat and Chev. Now, Dapper Rat Chick was also playing a Hunter midrange deck. So, as usual with these decks, I'm just going to go over the slight differences as opposed to anything else. Now, what this deck was playing is it was playing the second River Croc instead of the second Flare, looking for more of that early game pressure as opposed to the trap clearing ability against other hunters, and a little bit less of the cycling. The other thing is Leroy Jenkins. Leroy Jenkins is very, very powerful in these kinds of decks because, especially in a combo focused deck like mid-range, it works incredibly well with Unleash the Hounds. It just gives you 2 extra targets for your Unleash. Now, you may think they cancel out, but they don't, because the 2 dogs give you 2 Scavenging Hyena triggers and 2 Starving Buzzard triggers, which means that your Unleash the Hound combo draws 2 extra cards for free, and also takes away Leroy Jenkins' drawback. Little crazy if you think about it. It can also just be used to finish off your opponent, as if you have a Timberwolf, that's 4 extra damage from the Leroy. It's absolutely crazy. On to Simiju's playing Handlock. Second week in a row that Handlock has come second place on the EU. So, Handlock is a very, very slow Warlock deck as opposed to the Zoo deck we saw earlier. It relies on the Shields Up engine. Shields Up engine starts with 4 Giants and Ancient Watchers and Twilight Drakes. All defensive minions that can actually put in the hurt. Apart from Ancient Watcher, you need Silences to really do that, but there's only the 1 Iron Beacon on the deck. Can be relevant, however. But the Giants generally work to end the game, while the Twilight Drake and the Ancient Watchers serve to stall out the game. Now, you enable these through Defender of Argus and Sunfury Protector, not Ancient Watchers. Sunfury Protector, it costs a lot less than Defender of Argus. 2 mana is actually a very big deal because it means you can life tap on top of it. And Defender of Argus just gives you +1/+1 on each. So generally these lists, they do play 4, but if you ever play 3, I would drop 1 Defender or not 1 Sunfury, because they pretty much have the same stats, and the bonus is not generally worth the 2 extra mana. But you just play both because you need both in this particular deck. As for the rest of the deck, we have Earthring Farseers to offset some of the life tap problems, Sylvanas along with Alexstrasza's late game. There isn't a Jaraxxus in this deck, which is very interesting. Alexstrasza is functioning as the 9-drop in this particular version. Alexstrasza is a lot more offensive than Jaraxxus is. Jaraxxus is a bit more defensive. He starts setting up golems that you can Shadow Flame, and he's a very, very slow clock, whereas Alexstrasza is a lot more friendly to things like Giants. You can play your Moltons if you Alexstrasza, and you can also keep using Life Tap. It can also be used for a lot of burst damage if you're against another control deck like Warrior Control, for example. Sylvanas is sort of the mirror breaker, very, very good against other control decks, okay against it's okay against aggro, but it's mostly the anti-control card. And then lastly for the minions, we have Leroy Jenkins. Now Leroy functions with Power Overwhelming as the 10 damage swing combo at the end of the game. Speaking of spells, most of these decks play 3 AoEs. This one is playing the full 4. We have 2 Shadow Flames along with 2 Hellfires. Hellfire is worse against some of the aggro decks because you take damage, but Shadow Flame has a bit of drawback in sacrificing a minion. So it's basically pick your poison as opposed to which one's better. They both are above par on the board clearing and they both get the job done. Most of the time you play 2 of one, 1 of the other, but in this case he wants the full 4. Now, onto the other removal spells, we have Mortal Coil. Mortal Coil is generally used to deal with things like Leper Gnome and Harvest Golem over anything else, and it lets you cycle out later on some of the bigger minions if you're trading. Then we have 2 Siphon Souls. Siphon Soul is one of the major reasons to be playing this kind of deck. It lets you get past anything in the format more or less that hasn't got some crazy death rattle, and you gain life off it. The life gain actually saves you a lot more than you think. It's an extra life tap for free, and you get to kill something. Now, onto the last 2 decks. We have, from Thanhat, a deck that I never thought I'd actually see. Murlocs. Yes, a Murloc deck actually made it to top 4. I am extremely impressed, my good sir. So, now, I'm not going to go over any of the non-Murloc elements of this because I already have really with the Zoo deck. With the exception of Blood Knight, which is mostly used with Argent Squire to get a 6/6, and Doomguard, which is here instead of Argent Commander because it's cheaper. Now, as for the Murlocs, we do in fact have Old Murkai gives that final punch to the actual deck, and is the reason why you're not playing Leroy Jenkins. We then have Murloc Tidecaller, which is a 1/2 that just gets bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger. These Tidecallers, if they don't get killed pretty much instantly, they will generally do between 5 and 10 damage each. That is a rough estimate. They are actually more dangerous than Knife Jugglers, and they are 1-drops. As the rest stop, Murloc Tidehunter, perfect follow-up to Tidecaller, makes 2 Murlocs, gives you a bunch of punch. And while they both are very, very low on the actual stats, once you start getting some of the Tribal Lords out, it just completely wrecks your opponent. Speaking of these Tribal Lords, I already talked about Old Murkai, which just makes a damage for every single one. Then we have Murloc War Leader, which gives 2 damage and 1 health to everything on the board and just makes everything completely deadly. Even the Tidehunter token becomes suddenly a 3-2. Very, very powerful card, arguably one of the best cards in the entire deck and what really drives the Murloc engine. We then have Cold Light Seer, the other Lord, which gives +2 health to everything. And once you play that, your board is not dying, basically. If you have a big board, if you're ahead and you pull a Seer, you win. Whereas with War Leader, if you don't win on that turn, he can't be removed and you can still lose your board. But with Seer, you mostly just don't lose your board and you win. Lastly, for the Murlocs, we do in fact have Bluegill Warrior, which is simply a 2-1 for 2 with charge. With all the tribal bonuses, it can become essentially an Arcane Golem for 2 mana with no drawback. If you have a War Leader on the board, it can also become a 2-3 with a Seer, or just generate some extra value of Old Murkai. Very good answer to Fairy Dragon as well. As for the spells, playing similar suite as the Zoo deck, just -1 Power Overwhelming and -1 Mortal Coil. Lastly, we're on to Chev, who is playing the only Druid Ramp deck. There was no Warrior! There was no Warrior this week. Very refreshing, there wasn't a Warrior. It's been in pretty much every top 8, or top 4s technically, as long as I can remember. Anyway, so on to the last deck, we have Druid Ramp. Now this deck is one of those decks which focuses on getting to late game as quickly as possible by removing anything early and ramping up to your big threats. So, starting with the minions, we have Blood Mage Thalnos, which is mostly here to cycle and also functions very, very well with Swipe and Wrath. Then we have Cairn and Sylvanas to hold down the mid game, along with Black Knight, as you don't have hard removal, you need to get over some of those big taunts. Things like opposing Ancient Wars or Druid of the Claws come to mind, or even something like Earth Elemental, which is traditionally very difficult to deal with for a Druid. And then I have Ragnaros as the big drop in this deck. Instead of Cenarius or Ysera, we have the Ragnaros that has a much more offensive presence than either of those two, where Ysera is a more card advantage and grindy type creature, whereas Cenarius is very defensive in most situations. He can be offensive, but he's mostly defensive. Now, moving on to the Ancients, we have Ancient of War, which can be accelerated out on turn 5 or earlier, and stonewall pretty much every aggro deck that does not have either hard removal or some form of silence. It just goes straight past, and they can't get past 10 life. They just can't get past the 10 life Ancient of War. Then I have Ancient Allure, which mostly will be functioning as card draw, as I said on the last weekly. For my top 10 class minions, I put this at the top, and I maintain that. It draws cards, it heals you. If you want my full opinions on it, go to the actual video. And then I have Big Game Hunter, again, same role as Black Knight, but it's dealing with Ragnaros as opposed to taunts. Defender of Argus, very, very useful against things like Hunter and Zoo decks. You need the taunts, and in this particular deck, anything with taunt will generally stonewall them, just they can't get past. Even things like Keeper of the Grove. Keeper of the Grove, very, very good answer to aggro decks and also Handlock in the silence, but it's a 2-4 and that becomes a 3-5. It just becomes a Sen'jin if you have Defender of Argus next to it, and that will generally, at that point you've killed two minions and it's a Sen'jin, so it's just ridiculous. Stampeding Kodo comes up next, which has been an up and coming 5-drop. It really has been doing a lot. This is mostly because the limited format, Stampeding Kodo, is slowly becoming very, very popular in limited and is starting to spill over into standard, and it's a very, very good drop against some of the aggro. If you notice that this deck is very powerful against aggro, it has to be. It has to be focused on aggro. The metagame is very fast at the moment, and generally you beat the bigger decks by being faster than them. You play control versus aggro and aggro versus control. Lastly, for the minions, we have Druid of the Claw, which is the epitome of that. Taunt form most of the time, but can be used as a 4-4 with charge to slowly wear your opponent down. Then Chillwind Yeti for the trading efficiency, and Sen'jin as your extra defense against aggro earlier. As for the spells, we have Standard, Innervate, Swipe, Wrath, Force Nature, Savage Roar. We then have one Marker of the Wild for that taunt, and also a little bit of extra reach, 2 extra damage, never hurt anyone. And lastly, 2 Wild Growth to really accelerate out your threats, and it's one of the linchpins of this entire deck. Anyway, thank you all for watching. If you like the content, please subscribe. If you have any feedback, put it in the comment section below. As for now, this has been Jotto, signing off.